In this podcast, I'm going to talk about Venus in Pisces. Now, yesterday I talked a lot about Venus and the characteristics of Venus. I said Venus represented this natural affinity which exists within the nature of things, which relates them to each other. And so that a connection exists between the internal nature of things that draws them together. Okay. I also talked about this connection being the perception of a natural affinity between things. I gave numerous examples of this. Now, the affinity itself, this need for things to come together based on the similarities contained in their differences, so that the differences between objects kind of interact and relate and lock together as a type of affinity and harmony. Now, the perception of this affinity and this harmony is the Venusian instinct, okay, within a human being. And I've reduced this to the sense of pleasure that comes originally from the sense of taste. And I talked about how this sense of taste, is formed and highly developed in the infant and becomes the bedrock upon which all the other material senses are calibrated. And that the calibration really is a directional sense towards that which is pleasurable and comfortable and risk averse. And then a deliberate moving away from that which is uncomfortable, unpleasurable, and risky. And I said that this is a natural instinct within the individual. So this natural affinity between things becomes a well-developed sense of perception in the adult, which forms a cognitive map which will eventually guide the individual in their determination of what constitutes personal ownership, value, and personal space. This notion of personal space really is important because it is from this notion that the idea of boundaries come into existence. The ability to define what is yours is also the ability to define what is good for you. And so the idea of Venus is a notional sense of direction towards that which is good for you. So where you have Venus in your natal chart is pointing you towards that aspect of existence or that aspect of your reality that is intrinsically good for you. It is pleasurable. It is easy. There is a sense of comfort in that direction, whether it be the house or the sign. Okay. Now, this natural affinity also shows up as a sense of attractiveness. Because when you find something attractive, you are drawn to it. Now, there's a reason why you find certain things attractive. It's because within that thing, you can see the manifestation of this sense of ease. Okay? You see that the idea of things coming together in proportion or symmetry. Different people have different notions of what is attractive to them. But that notion itself encapsulates what you consider to be a sense of ease. The ease of coming together, the ease of relationship. Okay. And what this really represents is a trajectory, a path, so that where you have Venus in your natal chart, all the circumstances and the context surrounding it describe the pathway that you find easy. And you are naturally drawn to that pathway. I mean, you really have to be ignoring yourself to ignore that particular trajectory or that particular pathway. Because that's where life is easy for you. Now, you know what they say, you don't have to always go in the easy direction, because at some point, if you have to grow, you have to exit your zone of comfort. You have to go into a zone you're not comfortable with, and that is how growth occurs. But your zone of ease and comfort represents, where you fall back to, where you go to recuperate, to recollect yourself. Maybe if you've just had a harrowing experience. But most people tend to ignore their Venus placements when they're in search of a mate. But your Venus placement is already active in your head. So when you find somebody attractive, it is always important to understand why you find the person attractive. Is it just a physical attraction, or do you like the behavior? And if you say you like the behavior, then how many behaviors have you really seen? Because behavior is a response, and there are as many responses as there are environments. So that before you can claim to be attracted to someone based on their behavior, you have to have experienced that behavior or the response of this person to extremely varied environments that can now draw out different types of behaviors. That's really what it is. That's how you get to know people. You must see them in all sorts of environments. See them under pressure, see them when they're happy and all that. Now, your Venus placement is that instinct that is telling you precisely what you consider to be attractive. And because of that, it is also what pulls you towards that which you find beautiful or that which you find attractive. It's a notional sense. It's a sense of value. But the value that is being perceived is not really coming from the person or from the environment. It's coming from you. It is your sense of value, self-value, that translates into what you find valuable in the world. So that what you find valuable and attractive in the world is a representation of you. It is not a representation of the world. Okay? Now, that notion in astrology is called Venus. When you have Venus underexpressed, it leads to a very inaccurate sense of self-worth, where you do not value yourself considerably. And this tends to happen because people are battling with all sorts of emotions like shame and all that, where the individual does not know how to meet themselves at the right value. And as a result, they do not know how to set their personal boundaries. And so they keep having problems with interpersonal relationships, especially when so much is asked of them in these interpersonal relationships. And there is a blowback process where they feel exhausted and drained because they keep giving. Now, givers need to set boundaries because takers never do. And when Venus is overexpressed, the reverse is the case, where the individual is extremely gluttonous. They are hedonistic. They are solely in it for themselves. And they become very narcissistic because they are takers. They take and they take and they take because they feel they deserve to drain you, or they deserve to take so much from you or from the environment or from anybody. Okay? Because their sense of self is hyperactive. It's overinflated, and they need to feed that sense of self-value. Okay? In both cases, in both extremes, the perception of Venus is incorrect. Okay, and so the over and under expression create disturbances within the life of the person. The over tends to get corrected at some point in time, and the under also tends to get corrected, so that you can find your natural sense of self-value and then build a reality system that has balance and harmony within it. That sense of balance is coming from your Venus placement. Now, Pisces is an extremely different thing from Venus, and it's a water sign, and I've talked about the nature of Pisces in my podcast on Pisces rising. It is very detailed, but I will summarize, for this particular podcast. Now, in essence, Pisces is nothing. Yeah, you heard me correctly. Pisces and its ruler, Neptune, it's nothing. So that anything that goes into Pisces becomes nothing. It takes it, whatever substance is remaining within it, within whatever it is, once you place it into Pisces, it dissolves into nothing. So that you can imagine that any structure, be it a three-dimensional structure like a cube or cylinder or whatever, once you throw it into Pisces, it disappears. Now, it's still there, but it's not there in any form that is material. Okay? So, it goes in there and it becomes what you would call spiritual, but the reduction to spirituality is basically just dissolving that thing into non-physical states. And you have, if it's physics, you have many non-physical states. You have solid, liquid, gas, and then you have plasma. But then you also have radiation. Okay, now, the solid, liquid, and gas obviously are physical states. The plasma is also a physical state. Radiation, you can't really call it physical now, can you? It's light, basically. And that's what happens to anything that you throw into Pisces. It just dissolves into nothing. It's still there in energetic form, but you can't get a handle on it. Okay, and that's the nature of Pisces. Now, Pisces is the 12th sign of the zodiac, or you could call it the first. There is no clear definition regarding whether it's the first or the 12th, whether it's the first or the last. Because if you take the ascendant as a starting point, then Pisces is the 12th. But sometimes the synthesis of a natal chart needs to start from the 12th house, especially when the same sign covers the 12th house and the first house. And then the synthesis needs to start from the cusp of the 12th house, because the 12th house and Pisces by extension represent what's going on in the womb. It's a completely watery world where the individual really has no sense of self per se. Okay? Now, the potential for a sense of self exists, but it has not been activated. And prior activation, it exists as some type of watery state where it is distributed all over. It cannot really come to a focus. And so planets that go into Pisces or even go into the 12th house, they have this distributed nature whereby they cannot focus on anything in particular. Rather, they are distributed across everything. And that's what happens when Venus goes into Pisces. This sense of Venus, like I've described, Venus is a notional sense of direction towards that which makes you comfortable, which makes you pleasurable. It is a trajectory that takes you from a place that you may find uncomfortable to a place where comfort exists and pleasure exists and there is ease. So Venus represents a trajectory from one place to another. And the point of that trajectory is that it is supposed to change what you would describe as your fortune. You go from a place that is not good for you to a place that is good for you. It is your Venusian sense of direction that guides this process. It allows you to pick what is good. This will be good for me. This person will be good for me. Nah, this person will not be good for me. Or nah, this environment will not be good for me. It's your Venusian sense of direction that allows you to pinpoint that which is good for you. When this trajectory goes into Pisces, it dissolves into nothing. So that when Venus finds itself in Pisces, the common problem emerges. It doesn't know what is good for it. It cannot find that trajectory. And in that space where Pisces is, right, where everything dissolves, then impressionability becomes the key, because impressionability is your imagination. And within that space where everything has dissolved into nothing, you can use impression to create whatever type of structure that you want. It's like we do in the movies. We can create whatever type of narrative we want, and we can make the narrative seem like it's real. But there's no grown-up person who's really watching movies or watching things on the TV that believes that what they're looking at on the TV is real. They don't. Nobody does. It's part of common sense, right? Yeah, good luck explaining that to Venus in Pisces. They actually believe that all these impressions are real. How can't they? They don't have any other way of experience in the world. Now, if you didn't have any other way to tell that what you're watching on TV is real or not, you would believe it's real. And who could blame you? How could you tell the difference? That's the essential problem with Venus in Pisces. In the absence of structure, then the only thing left in the absence of physicality is spirituality. And in the spiritual realm, just like your dreams, you can conjure up whatever you want. Things don't have to make sense. It has its own internal logic. And in that space of that internal logic, you can create whatever you want. You can create whatever type of narrative. You can weave whatever kind of story that your mind can come up with. You are free to do as you please in that sense. Okay? And so most people try to create a type of structure within Pisces. Yeah, it holds for a while. But after a while, it dissolves because it's all impressionability. It's all impression. It's imagination. And so these structures are usually told in the form of stories. And so the stories revolve around seeking this comfort and this pleasure, seeking this aspect of reality that is good for them. So they weave a trajectory. They get a sense of direction that this is going to be good for them. And then they go there and they realize that there's really nothing there. It all dissolves. It's almost as if it didn't exist. And they are disillusioned by that. But it doesn't stop them from writing another story. They get to write so many stories that at the end of the day, it gets to a point where they are saturated with these stories and then anxiety sets in. Do you know why? Because there are too many stories. How do I know which one is real? How do I know what my value system really is all about when I can reconstruct it from anything? It doesn't matter what it is. Whatever I imagine, I can reconstruct as a value system. And this is the central problem of Venus in Pisces. Now, there is a solution, obviously. There is. Now, but the solution itself is, it involves a kind of gymnastics, but we'll talk about that. Before we get to the solution proper, we need to look at the essential nature of Pisces. What is it that's really going on in this sign that creates this type of impressionability? What's going on is really simple. Pisces, if you assume it to be the 12th house of the zodiac, is concerned with endings. We're talking about the end of physical existence. And when that is being considered, if you find an old person, someone who's lived a long life, and they're nearing the end of their life, they're concerned with what comes after this physical existence. Is it more physical existence? Or is it a type of spiritual existence? And if spiritual existence, what does it look like? What does it feel like? Will I still be there? Well, we can't know the answers to these questions for certain, but Pisces begins to give us an idea of what this transition point is like. Because in the 12th house, for instance, in Pisces, things go to disappear. And the way they disappear is they fade gradually into nothing. They dissolve. You see? So that astrology describes Neptune or Pisces as a dissolution of some kind. where the central concept of self basically dissolves, and it dissolves gradually in preparation for the end of life. And so people are concerned with things that endings usually bring, like legacy. What kind of story will be told about me? And then the mind begins to focus more on an existence beyond the physical. That drive towards that focus of existence beyond the physical is really a longing for the divine, for the spiritual, a deep drive to try to understand what comes beyond physical reality. What happens when I am no longer a physical body? Where will I be? And so how this works is it translates into a yearning, a longing. That is an unconscious longing. It's not an attentive longing. It's always there in the background. This yearning for emptiness. This yearning for what you can only describe as the divine. And the way that it actually begins to come into the imagination, because that's where it starts its journey, is that it becomes a desire to unite everything together within the self into one type of understanding. And this drive is very powerful when it gets into the imagination. The individual wants to find a story that can connect everything in their existence into one, meaning a story for why they fell in love, why they fell out of love, why they were mistreated, why they were treated nicely. While everything needs to have meaning, and the meaning needs to tie back into the divine, meaning there has to be something underneath all of reality that is controlling everything, giving everything its space. And so the Piscean is obsessed with this, with finding this oneness, this meaning, this story, this narrative behind everything. And so they go into this type of studies, even though they're still young, because, I told you Pisces is an energy that is more attuned to the human end of life. But those who have significant placements in Pisces, they can't escape this even while they're young. And while they're young, it appears very confusing because they don't know what to do with it. They don't know what to do with this thing in their head, this way that they are. They've always been like that, but in the early stages, they have no idea what to do with it. And so they investigate all sorts of things. But as they become older and wiser, they begin to realize what this is. And then they begin to have more constructive uses for it. Because like I've said in my podcast on Pisces rising, placements in Pisces are one of the most enigmatic and magical in the natal charts, because any type of story that you tell in Pisces can become reality, at least temporarily. So that it is the ability to bring down things from the imaginative world into physical reality, at least temporarily. And that's powerful, because you find that most of the things that we consider valuable in this world, they're imaginative. I'll give you an example. Take money, for instance. What is money? Money is a story, it's a narrative. It's told by a group of people who hold some type of authority, usually the ability to alter reality drastically for everybody. And then they issue you a paper that says, we owe you it's an IOU. That's what currency is. And with that, you can exchange it. You can transfer the debt. And then by transferring the debt between people, you can acquire things. You can exchange it for things. Money is a story. It's a narrative. It's an imaginative narrative. And that's why authorities that issue money, they can issue it in unlimited quantities. Because it doesn't come from anything. It comes from the imagination. It is not tied to anything in particular. It's tied to your story. And so you take something like the US dollar. It's a story. And the government's authority is to protect that story. That's what it does. It tries to protect the story so that people can find value within it. Now, once that fails, the entire thing goes bust. That is Piscean. That's the power of Pisces. And when you have Venus in Pisces, you have the ability to do this. Because Venus, like I told you, is that sense of comfort and the trajectory and the pathway to that sense of comfort. That pathway and that trajectory, it's a story. It's a narrative that you can bring down to reality. And the way to achieve comfort in today's reality is through money. You have a lot of money, you can live a very comfortable life. You can buy yourself all the pleasures that you want. So when Venus is in Pisces, the individual is imbued with this kind of spiritual power that allows them to bring down money from the imagination down into reality, because that's what money is. They just need to find the right story. Now, the catch is this bringing down process into reality it's temporary, because it cannot be sustained, because Pisces is literally immaterial. Okay? It's immaterial. So whatever you bring down tends to want to dissolve into nothing. That's why, you have central banks that carry out hidden processes trying to maintain the value of a currency. If they didn't do that, the currency would dissolve into nothing because it's nothing really. And so it is with the Venus in Piscean. They must be attentive to the stories that they're creating, because the tendency of these stories is to evaporate into nothing. So there's work to be done to maintain the immateriality of that as a material form. Now, if they tell too many stories that don't connect to each other, the whole thing falls apart and it becomes a fraud. That's really what it is. And then they suffer the loss of reputation that comes from that, and they have to start all over again. And usually, if this is done to such an expensive and extensive degree, then this dissolution of these narratives, this fraud, falls apart and puts them in a situation that is very Neptunian. You know what that is? They are hidden away. That's why some people say the 12th house is prison, mental institutions and all that. Is because this kind of society that we run does not permit certain types of narratives that put the entire structure in peril. So they tend to hide away or to smuggle away narratives that don't conform to the narratives of society. That's what a prison is. So Venus in Pisces has this ability to reach into the world, the spiritual world, where everything comes from, where everything first has meaning, and to bring that down into physical reality. But the physical forms are temporal, so they need to be sustained. Now, the way that this is being sustained is what the story of Venus in Pisces is all about. Now, another area where this happens is in the area of love affairs. Because what Venus in Pisces is looking for in a lover cannot be realistically achieved. It's impossible. Because what they are yearning for is the divine. They cannot really be satisfied by a living physical human being, because that's not what the Piscean function really is all about. The Piscean function wants to connect into a reality that is very spiritual, unknown, immaterial. And that's where that Venus wants to go. Now, they are drawn to individuals that display this ethereal, immaterial quality, either as part of their imaginative behavior or the kind of mystical nature of their behavior. The ability of these individuals to know things, to possess extensive knowledge about things that no one could possibly know. So they're drawn to these type of individuals that appear mysterious and hidden in some sense. Okay? But at the end of the day, no human being really is like that. So when the Venus in Pisces finally discovers that this person is just a mortal human being, then their interest wanes. Okay? Another thing that attracts them significantly is a human being that is under the weight of what you would consider to be Pisces. Somebody who can't take care of themselves. Somebody who is in need of help. Somebody who is hopeless, really. They're drawn to this type of people because in the eyes of those people, they can appear as self-sacrificing, ready to give all. And this is usually fantastic because these Venusian placements in Pisces, they are very sensitive to the undercurrent of human suffering. And so they're imbued with a lot of compassion. And if you've heard my podcast, you would hear where I say that compassion is the highest expression of the type of brain that we have. It is the most intelligent, most innovative part of our brain. That's what generates the ability to be compassionate, to be empathetic. Okay? So these people are some of the most intelligent people you will meet. And so from that intelligence, they're able to draw down a serious degree of compassion. But the problem with compassion is that not every human being is evolved to that level. There are people who are just waiting to take advantage of you. And that's precisely what happens when you have Venus in Pisces. You come across your own fair share of people who are ready to take absolute advantage of you, because compassion is a giving energy. That's what it does. It gives and gives and gives. It's a doorway that just opens up with no restrictions on giving. Now, even the Venus in Piscean is a human after all. They're drained eventually. Okay? Like I said, givers need to set boundaries because takers never do. The Venus in Pisces placement does not know how to set boundaries because boundaries are material things. They revolve around closures and personal value. The Venus in Pisces doesn't know what that is. It has no boundaries. It doesn't know where those boundaries would even fit into because it doesn't see them within itself. Every time it thinks of itself as a quantity that is expanding and filling all of space, connecting everything together. So how can they really define where that boundary is supposed to be. And so that's the way they also bring people in. They bring people in a way that is expanding. And the clash is always with the material world. The material world is the challenge for Venus in Pisces, because the material world tends to sustain itself almost permanently. Meanwhile, all the constructions and the creations of Venus in Pisces are temporal. So after a while, the Venus in Pisces runs out of steam and has to confront reality, especially those value-retaining processes in the world. Because it's one thing to create value, it's another thing to retain value, to retain a store of value. Now, since the creations of Venus in Pisces always tend to dissipate and dissolve into nothing, retaining value is a problem for them. And this comes from the fact that the person with the significant placement in Venus does not know how to remain one person or one thing. They are constantly changing. That is, the story that they tell themselves and about their reality is constantly changing. They have the ability to amend their stories on a whim, to change the narrative on a whim, so that they're able to become different people based on the environment they find themselves in. And so they have an almost unlimited variation in their behavioral responses. So that by the time that they create so many behavioral responses, they are saddled with a major problem. Who exactly am I? Which of my behavioral responses really is me? Because there's so many of them, and each and every behavioral response is a story. It's a narrative. And so you have so many narratives. And so Venus in Pisces, they struggle with what is the truth. What's the nature of truth? It's fluid. It moves around all the time because they are constantly moving around all the time. They want to settle down into patterns of behavior, regular, repetitive patterns of behavior, but they can't because the story in their head does not have that form. And so these people struggle with the structured everyday type of reality, where you had to wake up, go to work, and do the same thing 5 times or 6 times every week. They struggle with that. They struggle with repeated behaviors and things like that because their Venus in Pisces doesn't know what that is. And so the resolution is to find a way to drain all of that energy constructively, to drain it into an enterprise or into some type of process that allows them to convert that way of being into value. They can now use that value to define their own personal value as a measure of their personal value. And based on that, they can construct well-needed boundaries. And one of the key areas, important areas wherein you find the Venus in Pisces able to drain this energy is in the area of music. Also in the area of theater and film and all major artistic expressions. It all depends on all the other placements within a natal chart. Because if this person cannot find constructive outlets for these energies, then the energies will create the creation of an innumerable amount of narratives. And if these narratives are now created with reckless abandon, then they start interfering with each other. And at some point in time, they collapse into nothing. And that's the definition of fraud. That's really what it is. Somebody who is a deceptive by nature, especially where money is concerned. So it is very important that people with Venus in Pisces understand this energy that they carry and how to translate that energy into value. Now, nobody knows what Pisces is, just like nobody knows what Neptune is, because it really can be anything. And so these people have a talent for creating images, impressions. That's a fantastic talent if you're an actor or an actress. It means you can become anybody, especially for short periods of time. You don't have to become your character forever. You can become a character for a certain amount of time and then you let it go. So they are naturally attuned to this type of aptitude. They can also be excellent musicians. They can also be excellent caregivers, doctors, nurses, and people who are able to summon up a degree of compassion that allows them to go over and beyond in caring for others. And so a very good way to drain this energy is also to work in areas where you can sacrifice some parts of yourself. Donations, charities, and all that, they're very good for the person with Venus in Pisces. Also, they can dedicate themselves to the spiritual pursuit of God. That's really what it is, because as long as they don't become dogmatic about all of it, then it's fine. Because the idea is to provide a conduit or a channel for this energy to flow, because this energy is coming from a place that is beyond the physical realm completely. Now, when they are able to drain this energy by creating a reality whereby all their fantasies and their imagination can be sucked into that reality, and then they come back into our world and they can behave like regular people, engage in regular things, but they must go back to that reality because that's where their calling is. So it could be a fantasy world that they've created because they're writing a story. It could be a fantasy world they've created because they're in the theater and film industry. It could be a fantasy world they've created because they are musicians. It could be a fantasy world they've created because they are caregivers. Their calling is basically to go around the world helping those in need. Venus in Pisces is also very good at specific areas of scientific research, because Pisces allows you to merge with reality. And when you are able to merge with reality, you become one with reality in a sense for short periods of time, meaning that all the movements in reality synchronize with your being. And then you can bring them down into physical reality, and you can describe what these movements are. That way, creating brand new and innovative contribution to the field of knowledge. So it is not uncommon for people with strong Piscean placements, especially Venus in Pisces, pursue higher education, especially in these specific areas of science, where you can blend with the physical movements of the heavens, and so they also have a keen mind for astrology and everything spiritual. But you see, the potential for disillusionment is strong within these individuals. Remember, they are the ultimate creators of impressionability. And this goes for all significant placements in Pisces. But the Venus in Pisces is so impressionable regarding what they consider or where they consider to be a store of value. So they can be deceived. They can be deceived by impressions. So they may see an oasis somewhere in the distance and they say, oh, that's where the value is. And they work very slavishly, dedicatedly towards that destination. And when they get there, the whole thing just disappears as a mirage. And they are deceived. And whenever they're hurt in that way, they disappear. They disappear into their imaginative world because they need to heal. They need to find the center of everything again. The only way they can do this, because, they don't allow the formation of physical constructs. The only way they can do this is to find a narrative that explains why this has happened to them as part of an overall narrative, to bring meaning back into their reality. Otherwise, they're lost. When Venus in Pisces is lost, they drift. They become the overexpression or underexpression of Venus in the Piscean realm. So they create illusions. They deceive people. They switch from one personality to another, trying to get whatever they can or whatever they want, and then they disappear again. That's a Venus in Pisces carrying an unhealed hurt within them. That's really what it is. And when you hurt these people, they probably won't scream at you and shout at you. They just disappear. They just make themselves unavailable. And when they are in any type of crisis, their response to that crisis is to fade away, just disappear from the scene. Rather than maybe deal with the crisis head on and attack it head on, the tendency is to just fade away and, pretend it doesn't exist and try to move into another type of reality. So sometimes trouble also comes from that area, because ultimately the reality is pervasive and you need to somehow deal with it at the end of the day. But pretending that things don't exist is one of the superpowers of the Venus in Pisces. Now, rounding all of this up, it is important to understand that in this podcast, I have described Venus as a trajectory, a pathway that takes you towards what you value. So if your Venus is in Pisces, what you value is a reality system that is able to fulfill all your fantasies and all your dreams. That's what you value. You're searching for the supernatural, really. And so you are drawn towards things that have the potential to fulfill whatever fantasies are going on in your head. You don't know their fantasies. They seem very real because you can't tell the difference. You're not born with that aptitude to be able to tell the difference. And that's because part of your journey in life involves going into a realm where things have not crystallized into physical form yet, and then bringing down something from there, so that if you have to go into space, for instance, to the International Space Station and bring out something from the exterior of the space station, you're going to have to wear a space suit, because human life was not built to operate in the vacuum of space. It's the same thing. If you have to go to the spiritual realm, the imaginative realm where everything is possible, and then bring down something back into the physical world where there are rules, basically structured rules, you need something that can allow you visit that place and still come back here, because here is where you are based, on Earth, in the so-called physical realm. So you need a figurative spacesuit. Alright? And this you can construct. It's what you're going to have to construct before you are able to achieve tangible value on Earth. That's really what it is. So when I do a natal chart synthesis and I see a Venus in Pisces, right? Then the important thing is that to understand if this person has understood how to go to that realm and come back successfully, to bring down into this realm. And they can bring down all sorts of things. Usually they bring down things that nobody has ever seen before, because it's coming deep from the imagination. So they bring down all sorts of things. The problem now becomes being able to convert that thing to value, because that conversion process into value becomes their own value system, their own sense of self-value and self-worth. And if they can translate this into money, better for them, because that money now becomes the way that they're able to understand their own self-worth and the nature of their boundaries. A Venus in Pisces who has successfully understood how to make money in a socially acceptable manner, and they are well off because of that, they're amazing personalities. You meet them and it's like taking a slice of heaven. It's like visiting a realm of supernatural beings. These are people who have conquered both the physical realm and the imaginative realm. And so they're a sight to behold. And these are the gatekeepers. So whenever new stories or anything needs to come from the imaginative realm, they are the gatekeepers of these stories. They bring them down. Without them, you probably couldn't do that. You see? And this is their power. Can you imagine what type of power it is? Because it means that they are the gatekeepers of the boundaries of human experience. All the boundaries. Remember, in almost every area of human experience, you have these boundaries between what is known and what is unknown, between what is structured and what is unstructured. There are people whose job it is to expand these boundaries. They are your innovators. They are your storytellers. They are the ones that expand the narrative of the collective human story. That's the superpower when you have Venus in Pisces. When you fall in love with a Venus in Pisces, you have to understand that you are falling in love with an ethereal creature, a creature really not of this world, a creature that spends part of their time on Earth and part of their time in a different type of experience, which you might as well call a different type of existence or universe. They are beings that are driven by a supernatural story. And what they are searching for on Earth, part of it needs to be supernatural. You have to understand this, otherwise you're going to mischaracterize and misjudge this individual. Now, Venus in Pisces is not the only placement within a natal chart, so it's part of a wider narrative. And so it is important to understand how this wider narrative functions with respect to this Venus in Pisces, because then you're going to get all flavors of this theme. That's really what it is. But all in all, you should know that this person has a slice of heaven within them, a slice of the supernatural. So that whatever you need to be, there needs to be an ethereal element to your nature. You need to believe in the impossible. And you also need to believe and understand how the impossible can become possible. Now, it is not everything that can be brought down into reality, the physical reality, but a good number of it can be. And that's the essence of how we human beings expand the horizon of our consciousness. But you need to understand and support this person from that perspective. Don't expect them to be completely rational with you, because most of what they feel and part of what they feel, they will never be able to explain and translate into words. You will need to understand their need for solitude occasionally. They need to be able to disappear, because the only way they can charge their batteries is to reconnect to something that is greater than themselves. They need people who need them. That's really what it is. they connect by bringing out of themselves a tremendous amount of compassion and selflessness. That's how much they give. And so they don't do well with characters who appear so macho and strong and they can take care of everything, they can be everything, you don't need to do anything. No, they don't want to be taken care of. They want to take care of someone. They want you to need them. And if you have significant placements in Pisces, that placement itself is how you want somebody to need you. So a Venus in Pisces wants to love you as if you're sick, as if you're helpless. They want to be able to do everything for you. Yeah, they're going to once in a while nag that they're doing everything for you, yes. But this is what they really want. So if they cannot get it from regular relationships, what they do is they tend to serially befriend people who are down on their luck. People who find themselves in unfortunate situations through no fault of theirs. They just happen to be messed up in life. These people are so drawn to this type of people because they feel so much empathy and compassion for them. So if the Venus in Pisces doesn't have a drain, a constructive outlet, then this sense of their Venus begins to investigate all these possibilities. And so it is not unusual for Venus in Pisces to engage serially in relationships with people who are sort of like classified as unfortunate in life. People who are in need of help, people who need one thing or the other. Now, the drawback or the downside of this type of thing is that the Venus in Pisces may not be able to love someone who doesn't need them that way. And so it may be in their own self-interest to keep the person in such a position where they're always needy. That's the downside. It's like poisoning someone to keep them sick so that you can continue to take care of them. Yeah, this thing goes, So it is very important that the Venus in Pisces have a constructive outlet for this compassion, so it doesn't begin to investigate all these other possibilities.